What happened to Ethan Granger on the night of April 12, 2005? A young man with so much potential, only to have his life violently cut short. He was just 16. His body discovered hours later, abandoned and left to die in a lonely park. What could have led to such a savage act? For 10 long years, the police were unable to provide answers. But for Thomas Granger, Ethan's father, there was only one path left to follow. His quest for justice would lead him into the heart of darkness, driven by a thirst for revenge that would shape every aspect of his life. This is the story of a father's vengeance, a journey of grief, obsession, and the painful cost of justice. For a decade, the truth remained elusive. No one knew who killed Ethan Granger, or why. But Thomas Granger was about to embark on a journey that would shake everything he believed about justice, and the man he thought he was. Before the murder, the Grangers were like any ordinary family. Thomas, an accountant, and his wife Mary had raised Ethan with the kind of love and support that was the bedrock of their small-town life. Ethan, their only child, was the light of their world, bright, talented, and always on the go. He was the star of his high school soccer team, a model student, and a popular figure in their quiet town of Ashford. He had dreams of going to college and maybe even playing professionally. It was clear to everyone who knew him, Ethan was destined for greatness. Thomas watched with pride as his son excelled in everything he did. It was a bond that was unbreakable, grounded in years of shared moments, laughter, and unconditional love. In many ways, their life seemed perfect. A small house, a small town, and the kind of peace that only comes from the love of a family.
Ethan was one of those kids who just had a way about him. He was always so positive, always uplifting others. I think everyone around here thought he was going to be someone special. And Thomas, he was always so proud of him. It was like the perfect family.
The night of April 12, 2005 seemed like any other. Ethan had gone out with friends for the night, something he did frequently, but this time something was different. When Thomas came home late from work, the house was eerily quiet. Ethan was not there, and the silence that followed was far from normal. I knew something was wrong the moment he didn't come home. Ethan had never done that before. He always called if he was going to be late. Thomas, he stayed up all night, pacing. I've never seen him like that before. It's like he knew something had happened. For Thomas, the hours spent searching were agonizing. His mind raced with every possible scenario, but nothing could prepare him for what came next. At 3 a.m., the phone rang. It was the police. They had found a body. Ethan's body, lying lifeless in a park not far from their home. The scene was horrific. His face was battered, his clothes torn. The police ruled it an act of extreme violence, and they immediately began investigating. But they had no leads, no suspects, and no answers. Thomas arrived at the scene, already dreading what the police would say. His worst fears were confirmed when he saw his son's lifeless body on the ground. The rage, confusion, and heartbreak were overwhelming. But in the midst of that grief, one thought kept repeating in Thomas's mind. Who did this? And I remember the scene clearly. It was one of the worst cases I'd seen. The brutality of it, it wasn't a random attack. This wasn't just some robbery gone wrong. Whoever did this, they had a message to send. The police immediately began their investigation, but with no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no clear motive, the case quickly went cold. They had no answers, only questions that no one could answer. Ethan's death was a mystery, and the town of Ashford was left in shock. It was like a dark cloud settled over the whole town. Everyone knew Ethan, How could something like this happen here? I don't think any of us expected that we'd never get any answers. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Thomas's grief began to transform into something darker, something far more dangerous. The search for justice was no longer enough for him. He wanted vengeance, and he was willing to do anything to get it. The police worked tirelessly to track down leads, but nothing ever seemed to pan out. The investigation was riddled with dead ends. No fingerprints, no DNA, no reliable witnesses. It was like the killer had vanished into thin air. We checked all the boxes: family background, friends, acquaintances. Ethan was well liked, no enemies, no reason to suspect anyone, and the lack of evidence left us scratching our heads. As the months turned into years, Thomas became obsessed with finding the truth. He pored over the evidence time and time again, re-interviewed witnesses, and even went so far as to consult private investigators. But each lead brought him closer to a dead end. Thomas wasn't letting this go. He would stay up for hours every night, going through everything he could find. He wasn't just grieving anymore. He was hunting, and it consumed him. The frustration of not knowing gnawed at Thomas. His marriage began to deteriorate. He isolated himself from friends, and his obsession with the case grew stronger. Then, one name began to emerge. A name that kept popping up in the conversations of those who knew Ethan's social circle. David Marks. David Marks had a history of violent behavior. A convicted felon with a string of assaults, Marks was no stranger to the law, but there was no evidence to connect him to Ethan's murder. For Thomas, that didn't matter. He was convinced that Marks was the one who had killed his son. Yeah, I knew David. He had this violent streak, always getting into trouble, always angry, but I never thought he'd go as far as murder. Thomas began to dig into Marks's life, tracking his movements, questioning people who had known him. The closer he got to Marks, the more dangerous his obsession became. It wasn't just about finding the killer anymore. It was personal. It was about revenge. Every day became a hunt, a search for someone who might hold the key to Ethan's death. But no one could confirm what Thomas suspected, that Marks was involved. Marks himself was elusive, always just out of reach, taunting Thomas with his very presence. Thomas wasn't thinking straight by the time I came in. He had become obsessed. There were moments where I could see the man he used to be, the loving father. But it was buried under layers of anger and frustration. With each passing day, Thomas's obsession intensified. He couldn't let it go. He needed answers, and he was willing to stop at nothing to get them. If you watched to this point and you are yet to subscribe to our channel, kindly do so now. Our mission is to bring to you true crime stories happening around you. Back to the story, let's continue. By 2012, Thomas's life had become entirely consumed by his search for Marks. His marriage had fallen apart, his work had suffered, his relationships with family and friends deteriorated. All he could think about was revenge. He was no longer the man he had been, the loving father, the husband, the hard-working accountant. Now he was a man on a mission, driven by a single-minded need to make David Marks pay for what had been done to Ethan. Thomas began to blur the lines between right and wrong. He stalked Marks, showing up at his places of work, his favorite bars, and even his home. The once law-abiding citizen had now crossed over into vigilante territory. For Thomas, it wasn't just about finding the killer. It was about ensuring Marks would feel the weight of his son's death. The more he uncovered about Marks's life, the more he believed that this man was responsible. And in his mind, there was no turning back. I had a conversation with Thomas during this time. He wasn't just grieving anymore. He was out for blood. I tried to remind him that we were the law, that revenge wasn't the answer, but he had already crossed that line. Thomas's obsession led him to make dangerous decisions. He started confronting Mark's friends, pushing them for answers, threatening those who wouldn't talk. His quest for justice, driven by the pain of losing his son, had turned into a path of destruction, a path he was unable to escape. Then, in 2013, Thomas's persistence finally brought him face to face with the man he believed was responsible for his son's death. In an unexpected confrontation, Thomas cornered David Marks in a dark alleyway. The years of pain, grief, and rage came to a boiling point. "You killed my son," Thomas said, his voice breaking with fury. "And now you're going to pay." For a moment it felt like everything was about to end, but Marx's response would shatter everything Thomas thought he knew. "I don't know what I thought would happen. I was so sure. I was sure I had the right man. But when I confronted him, when I told him what I knew, he just looked at me. He didn't even try to deny it. He told me something I never expected to hear." In that moment, Marks didn't confess to the murder of Ethan. Instead, he revealed that he had nothing to do with it at all. He was innocent, and what's worse, he told Thomas that he had a secret, one that would haunt Thomas forever. That was the turning point for Thomas. Marks didn't admit to the crime, but he told Thomas something that made him doubt everything he thought he knew. It shook him to the core. It was like the rug was pulled out from under him. Marks, in his own twisted way, hinted that the killer had been someone Thomas never would have suspected, someone close to home. And that revelation set Thomas on a new path, a darker path, where the pursuit of revenge would finally reveal the truth. With Marx's cryptic words haunting him, Thomas couldn't rest. He began to re-examine every piece of evidence, every conversation, every person in Ethan's life. The more he dug, the more he began to question the possibility that the killer wasn't an outsider, but someone from within his own circle. Thomas was relentless. He started to look at people he had never considered before. Friends of Ethan, classmates, even people who were close to him and Mary. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was right in front of him. Then, in late 2014, Thomas uncovered something that made his blood run cold, a connection that he had overlooked for years. Ethan's best friend, Mark Donovan, a quiet and seemingly harmless teenager, had been the last person to see Ethan alive. And Mark, for reasons that no one could explain, had vanished shortly after Ethan's death. Mark was always a bit of a loner, but I never thought he was capable of something like that. He and Ethan were inseparable, but when Ethan was found dead, Mark just disappeared. No one knew where he went, and no one ever asked too many questions. Thomas's gut told him that Mark knew something, and after months of tracking down leads and piecing together fragmented clues, he found Mark. Mark had returned to Ashford, living under a new name, hiding in plain sight. When Thomas found Mark, I didn't know what to feel. I was still reeling from everything that had happened with David Marks. But when I saw Mark face to face, I didn't know if I was looking at the murderer or someone who had been complicit in it all along. Confronting Mark in 2015 was the final chapter in Thomas's search for justice. And what Mark revealed would change everything. In a chilling conversation, Mark Donovan finally confessed the truth. He had been the one who killed Ethan Granger. The revelation was staggering, as Mark admitted that the motive was a twisted mix of jealousy, anger, and confusion. Ethan had discovered a dark secret about Mark, one that he feared would ruin his life, and in a moment of blind rage, Mark had attacked Ethan. He had beaten him senseless, leaving him to die in that park, hoping that no one would ever find out the truth. Mark's confession shattered Thomas, but in the same breath, it brought a strange sense of closure. The man who had taken his son's life was finally caught. But the cost was immense. Thomas had spent 10 years chasing vengeance, lost in his pursuit of justice, and now, with the truth laid bare, he was forced to reckon with the toll it had taken on his soul. I spent so many years chasing this, I lost myself in the process. I wanted justice, but what I really wanted was to hurt him. And now that it's over, I don't know what to feel. I don't know if it was worth it. The truth came too late to heal the wounds of a broken father. Thomas Granger would never be the same again, and neither would his town. In the end, justice had been served, but the cost of that justice was far greater than anyone could have predicted. The story of Ethan Granger, of his murder and his father's pursuit of revenge, is a painful reminder of the destructive power of grief and obsession. For 10 years, Thomas Granger hunted a killer, believing that vengeance would bring him peace. But in the end, it was only the truth that could set him free. And yet, as he stands today, the father who once sought justice is left with the question, was it all worth it? Sometimes, the truth comes at a price. And sometimes, the only thing left after the hunt is the haunting silence of what could have been.